publisher reach out to you? Do you write on yoga? Do you write articles on yoga? How
No,
did you
I did
choose?
not. Yeah, it was so because I had by that time, see, remember, I had written 7 books by the
Yeah.
time, and they had been translated. So I suppose the publishing community kind of knew me. And this particular publisher, Jeko, the CEO, a guy called Akash Shah, I had met him in Pune in about maybe 8 or 9 years ago at some literary festival. And then we hit it off very well. And then he knew that I was very passionate about yoga. I would talk about it, and wonderful, you must do it. So our discussions were like that. And once in a while, on my WhatsApp thing, I write something about yoga on my status. So then he reached out to me on his own. It was like a cold call. He called me and he said, there's a need in the market for a book which I'm about to tell you about, and I think only you can write it. So I said, what is this now? So he said, look, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. We need a kind of interpretation from a self-help angle. Self-help angle. So I wasn't sure what that meant. So he said, we as a publishing house, we focus on books which are for mind, body, and soul. And typically we like to tell people that they can do these things themselves. And there's actually a substantial market for it. So can you write something on the Yoga Sutras? So I said, fine. Now I had glanced at it casually, but it was frankly overhead transmission quite a lot because it is a lot of very dense material, as I found out later. So I said, fine. So I looked at the Sanskrit and I looked at a number of different interpretations. And there were many of them by people much more well, I mean, sincerely, they're up there. Vivekananda, Edwin Bryant,
Yeah.
B.K. Iyengar. So many people who have really great spiritual depth have written. So who the heck am I to write about this? Was my thought. Okay. So then we try to figure out how to go about this so-called self-help. How do you do a self-help for Patanjali's Yoga Sutras? So then we went through a couple of false starts. Luckily, I had a very good editor. We had a couple of false starts. Now, let me explain to you that. Let me take a moment to tell you about the Yoga Sutras. Probably you already know, but okay, let me repeat. So Patanjali was this figure shrouded in history and mystery going back 2,500, 3,000 years. There's a lot of interesting stuff that he was half human, half snake, and some say he was in Punjab, some say he was in Chidambaram. Nothing is clear, but he was, in any case, he has a reputation for writing 3 books, 3 major things. One is the Yoga Sutras, and the other one is on Ayurveda, and the other one is on grammar. Okay, but the Yoga Sutras, I think, is where people know him the most. Okay, but any case, so he and the history of how he came to Chidambaram, how he watched the dance between Shiva and Parvati. It's all very beautiful. How he came from the heavens, lovely stuff. So any case, he had written this 196 sutra thing, which tells you what is yoga. And the brilliance of his communication is so amazing that I teach, Rashmi, as you may know, I also teach business communication in terms of writing. So I have these certain models of how to write, how to frame your work, all that. Okay, and then when I read the whole thing, I realized that this guy had predated us by 3,000 years in terms of how to communicate. Over and above what the content was, the mechanism of communication was extraordinary. And I will tell you what I mean. So typically when we start writing on something, let's say we start talking about global warming. Okay. So how would we typically write a thing on global warming? We'd say, okay, this is the data, this is what's happening, terrible stuff is going on, and then this is the other implications, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, this is what it means. And we need to take action. This is the typical flow we have been taught in our schools, that this is the way. And it's nothing wrong with it, but that's the way. Now, the problem is in modern times, people don't have the time to read your huge essay and want to get to the point. What do you want to say? So a number of models have come up in the West, especially in the management consulting field, where oddly enough, I've consulted them on told them how to train their consultants to write like this for maximum impact. You start with the end first. You start with the conclusion first. Okay, then work it backwards. So now, what did Patanjali do? Patanjali has 4 chapters. The first chapter is called the Samadhi Pada. Okay, he starts the very first line is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's the first line, which is yoga is a cessation of all stimulus. You don't let your mind get this thing. Now, so in other words, he reached the conclusion first. He starts with the conclusion. And the rest of the chapter is all about the state of samadhi, types of samadhi, how to get, I mean, what are the mechanisms, intricacies, layers, subtext, what are the kinds of things that will stop you from getting there, including bad health, laziness, all that stuff. Very brilliant practical stuff is written there. So that's the samadhi. That's chapter 1. Now, chapter 2, he says, okay, now that you know what samadhi is, let me tell you how to get there. That's called the sadhana pada. So observe the structuring of his thought process. Because now he's got you hooked. He's got you hooked because you know what the end state is going to be. So how do you get there? Then he starts talking about the 8 branches of yoga, in which he says the third branch is asanas, which is what we do, the physical part. And just for the record, since we're talking, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. These are the ashto angani, eight branches of yoga. So now if I open a yoga class, students say, I'm going to teach you yoga, and I say, first is yama, niyama. Yama is your outward behavior. I'm going to teach you how to behave with the outside world. Do you think anyone's going to come? No one's going to come, right? So if we just jump directly to the third and fourth, which is asana and pranayama, that's pretty much what it is. But it starts from there. So he gets into great detail, and there are these 5 of the 8 are what we call bahiranga, which is to say the physical body and outward behavior. These are the 5 angles or angs of the thing. Then you go, then you go inside antaranga, which is dharana, dhyana. So observe the communication dynamics, beautiful way he structured it so that you can't go wrong. It's just an extraordinary piece of work. So that's the second part, is the method to get there. The third is a very interesting one, and many call it a mystical part of Patanjali's work. It is called the Vibhuti Pada, which talks about the kinds of dangers that the kinds of powers and dangers that you will actually experience during this exposition. Now, those you may say these are all nonsense, black magic or whatever it is. That's up to you. I don't believe so. I believe that persons who do what he's talked about can achieve certain extraordinary powers, which is difficult to explain and may not bear the so-called scrutiny of quote unquote Western science. It doesn't matter. It's just the way it is. For those of us in music, we know how the sounds of certain kinds of rags make a difference. The sound of the tanpura, what it does to you, how certain some of your senses are heightened and all those things. So there's a lot of amazing stuff in that. And finally, he concludes with a final greater exposition, like an executive summary, and explaining more, what the state of samadhi is. And he ends with an unbelievably beautiful visual description of what he calls dharma mekha samadhi, which is like at that point, your karmas are gone, your kleshas, gunas, everything is destroyed. Even knowledge has no meaning. He says things like that. And then you're out a solitary splendor of light. So, it's difficult to explain because both the Sanskrit and then put it together, it's very beautiful to read, all the stuff. So I don't, that's a long answer, but you asked how it started. So that's what I said, he said, let's do this as a self-help. So what did I take these 196 sutras? I took them 15 sutras at a time. I took the entire bunch of Sanskrit stuff to the end and the appendix so that people don't get sidetracked by the fact that they don't know Devanagari, they don't know Sanskrit. Because in my opinion, many of these books which try to explain our ancient scriptures falter in the sense that the reader doesn't know what to make of it. Yeah. So if they get disturbed in their thinking because they can't understand Sanskrit, there's a high probability they will stop reading after 3 or 4 pages because they don't know what to make out of it. So I think this hit us, me and my editor, that let's take the sutras to the end and just stick to collections of the basic thoughts in these 15 things. Instead of doing a line by line analysis, instead of having tangential explanation that in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna said this, or in the Rig Veda, this happened. No, none of that. So it's fairly simple. Lots of my own experiences, for example, things I talked about, my father helping me and so on. I've talked about it. I will put a lot of classical music references there, how Rag Marva is like this and Rag Ramkali is like this and so on, because they actually help in explaining certain kinds of concepts. And at the end of every chapter, I talk about, which is very common, the takeaways of the chapter. I don't like that word, but it works. The 3 top takeaways from these 15, this composite bunch of 15 sutras. So that's how we progress through that. And there are lots of graphics. Graphics help. It's a modern technique which we must use. Okay, so there are about 15 or 20 graphics. I got someone in Canada to help me, a bright young lady. She did it for me. So that is also going to help the visual relief of the reader and also explains important concepts to them. So that's how this whole book happened. And during the period of writing, I went into some kind of a catatonic trance. Maybe it sounds exaggerated, but I think it wasn't, because That's all I was thinking about. Line by line, I tried to see what what beautiful thoughts this man has written, and how others have written about it. I compared. I had this table, which is a mess you can't see, but I typically live in a mess. So lots of books over here opened up, and I'm reading this and reading this, the Sanskrit, reconciling contradictions, and getting mentally exhausted. So when it finished, it was like, I don't think I'll ever be able to write anything like this
Yeah.
any in the future. It's not possible. I might write, but not equivalent in terms of mental intensity